Yes, at all. Okay.
All right, here we are. Sorry about that. It's always additional security. So let us begin. Good evening. This is R.A. Judy with Ideas in Future, and I am quite pleased to be in conversation with four young Palestinian activists on the ground in the West Bank. This is one of what I imagine to be a series of conversations with young activists around the world, and including eventually being able to have a conversation where they all come together. And that conversation is part of a humble effort on our part in Ideas and Futures to facilitate a greater solidarity. The four who are with us today are truly quite remarkable people, age notwithstanding, but definitely remarkable as young people for what they've accomplished. With us are Rana Nazal Hamadeh, who is a Palestinian artist and activist. And in her activism has been very much immersed in diverse community organizing, including the Turtle Island project in Canada, where she also holds a citizenship. And hopefully we'll have a chance to talk a bit more about that connection. She has an exhibit coming up, which looks quite interesting. 1/1000th of a dunam, a very old Ottoman land category, which focuses upon the displaced Palestinian people's practice of collecting portions of the land and the soil. She's also produced in 2020 a small documentary, Something from There. Also joining us are Awad Manaf Abbas, a graduate of humanitarian action, whose work is focused on statelessness and forced migration, specifically under military occupation, focusing on issues of identity and exile. In addition to her background in English language and literature, and by the way, she's an extraordinarily good and promising writer, she's currently working as the research and campaigns assistant with Amnesty International. And since 2014, she's worked in the development, health, and human rights sectors with local and international organizations. She's published a number of articles on Palestine and global issues. Other than writing, she enjoys the cultural, artistic scene and has volunteered in several initiatives and activities. And again, in our conversation, I want to explore really the seriousness, the gravitas of the aesthetic practices. And then joining us is Razan Quran, who is a Palestinian organizer, psychologist, and facilitator, and is currently completing a doctorate degree in clinical psychology at George Washington University, and works as a clinical psychologist at the Palestinian Counseling Center. When I was going over that aspect of Razan's biography, I couldn't help, being a long student of Fanon, to want to explore the nature of that kind of psychological therapy along Fanonian lines, but we'll get to this. She provides psychotherapeutic services to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Prior to this, Razan was the regional organizer in the US South with United Students Against Sweatshops while completing studies in Memphis, Tennessee. And across all of our speakers, there's that common thread of organizing not merely in Palestine, but with other movements around the world. Razan has connected experiences in life in Palestine with the settler colony on Turtle Island, utilizing the differences and similarities towards cultivating collective liberation and transformative justice in the mental health field. And I like her motto, which is from Audre Lorde: revolution is not a one-time event. And then finally, Ahmed Shweiki, who is a Palestinian lawyer specializing in land law. He received his BA in law from Berzit University and a master's degree from Sorbonne in Paris. He stands on the board of Baladi, Palestinian Animal Rescue Team based in Palestine, and ANES, Humanists Rising from Muslim Communities. His interests are politics, social studies, and football. And we mean proper football, not that American stuff. And I won't use that S word, which is an anthem in my household. as well as politics and philosophy. So I want to thank the four of you for agreeing to do this in your busy schedule, especially in these rather tumultuous times where you're at in the West Bank and in Gaza, as well as for all of us. But I want to get into the nature of your work. So I have a couple of general questions. And one of the things that I find quite interesting about what's going on now in Palestine and the nature of the work is the way in which, as we saw in Tunisia and as we saw in Algeria and as we saw in Sudan, this movement is being spontaneous and in large measure led by the young people. And I want to explore the specifics of that and what that means in terms of previous moments. Now, most of the coverage, and I know, Rana, you've had some interviews about this in the West, has focused on the issue around Sheikh Jarrah as if it were a new event, and is focused on the issue of Israeli injustices, which are legion, and is focused on the issue of really representing Palestinians as victims and as merely reacting, whether rightly or wrongly, to current settler situations. But what's lacking, in my view, is any engagement with what you on the ground are thinking and imagining you're doing and what your motivations are. So the first question I want to ask in terms of the events that have transpired over the past 3 months, including the general strike, I want to speak to that because that's a singular moment in which 1948 Palestinians, those who were included within the Israeli states and have something like Israeli citizenship, have been in coordination and alignment with Palestinians in the occupied territory and in Gaza to stage a really significant labor strike, right? That showed two things: the extent to which the Palestinians as a workforce are integrated in an essential way in the Israeli economy. They're not really disposable, but also the extent to which there's a kind of emerging collaboration occurring across these communities that we're supposed to believe historically aren't the same, or at least not united. Those events incline me to want to ask a very simple question, forgive its simplicity. Is what we're seeing right now another intifada? Or is it different from the previous two intifadas we've seen? And if it's not an intifada, how is it different from them? And if it is an intifada like them, what's its relationship to them?
I can start to speak. First off, thank you for hosting this, and thank you for your coordination and planning all the questions and all that. Second of all, I would like to, before addressing your question, reiterate for anyone who might be listening to this or might watch this later, our condemnation of the assassination of Nizar Banat, a Palestinian activist, by the Palestinian Authority security forces, and of course, send our condolences to his family. Right now, as we speak, so far 9 people have been arrested during a protest against the assassination of Nizar Banat by the PA security forces in Ramallah, and the number might be more than we know, which is an extension of the Israeli occupation policies against Palestinian activism in general. To address your question about, whether we could consider this an intifada or not, I don't think that this is necessarily, if we want to compare it to the previous intifadas in 1987 and 2000, that this could be an intifada in that sense. It's certainly a lot less militarized. There is a lot less military action in the West Bank and in Jerusalem and the 48. During both intifadas, there was a lot more clash in all of historic Palestine, whereas now, because of the siege on Gaza. Mostly the military action only takes form of assaults on Gaza and outside. It is definitely something that I feel personally cannot be still named, maybe, and that's kind of a good thing, I think, because it's still something that is very popular. It's something that mostly people on the ground, mostly young people are leading, which is something that you referred to before with the general strike, something that is mostly youth-led. There wasn't specifically one party or one segment of society that called for that strike, but it was something that was spontaneous and extended from every territory in the historic Palestine of the 48, Gaza, West Bank, and Jerusalem. So I don't think we can necessarily say it's an intifada. It is a popular movement, a popular not uprising, but it's definitely a popular action that's taking place on the ground.
It's okay. I'd like to jump in, Ahmed. Thank you, R.A. Judy, for your question as well. Because it gives us a chance to think about it instead of also just being in our bodies in the moment. I feel I agree with Ahmed on some things and kind of differ and want to add to that complexity. There's definitely, in terms of similarities between, I mean, there's a lot of differences anyways between the first and the second intifada in itself. But one line of similarity I will say is the utilization of music, of certain ways of expression that are re-emerging. Whether, you know, it used to be graffiti on the walls, and now when you look at the amazing amounts of like multimedia projects being done by underground artists in Palestine. I mean, if we also just reference Dabour and Shabir Jdeed's song in Anna, where it's playing and what kind of avenues. For me, that's something that harkens to when I hear songs of the past and how it's passed in our households. Where I feel that it differs is that there has been a more systematic fragmentation, and you know, in referencing Fanon, that atomization has been deeply entrenched, even just looking at the material reality of neoliberalism in Palestine and what's happened with people being so dependent on loans and how suffocating that is. The increased urbanization and creating this illusion that Ramallah is the epicenter, and what that's done to families and the kind of the nafas, the breath, how long you can hold to be out there. And I believe that's why the youth have erupted. We have a different kind of negotiation with the risks and the compromises. And so that's enabled us in many ways to be in this place. Where I differ shway with Ahmed is, I don't know to what extent it is spontaneous. And I say this because spanning from the Mufaz protests, 2011, 2015, رفع العقوبات, uplifting the punishments that the PA placed on Gaza, the feminist-led protests for Isra al-Ghrayib and women that are being killed in 2018 and moving. It's been growing. And as we grow and as we kind of are testing the waters and seeing their new tactics of policing and detainment and carceral logics, we've been growing and developing. And I think that's where this uprising, this intifada, that I like that which is not named yet, Ahmed, you know, is coming from. And I think we're still seeing the trickles of it. I mean, it's true that the protests happening have been for Nizar Banat, but let's not forget, just like, you know, 2 days ago, what was lifted in the chants was Basil al-Araj's name as well. What was also lifted was in the chants is women speaking against the sexual harassment in the streets, saying like, there will be no free Palestine if there's no free women in our country, or those that identify this way. And today in specific, right, the call was to go out because yesterday lawyers, activists were detained. So it's kind of also, it starts with something, but we've been already feeling it, you know? So I feel, I don't know if this very much answers the question, but I'll definitely say I walked around it.
No, it's very good. And it's prompted me to have a number of follow-ups, but I want to hear from Waad and Rana before I I follow up.
Yeah, because I was thinking like when you said, because whenever there's some kind of response or an uprising or a protest that's happening anywhere in Palestine, the first, when it's like collective in different spots in different places in different areas, whether it's 48 or West Bank or East Jerusalem or Gaza, we always jump to the question like, is this like a third intifada? I feel like I've heard this phrase probably like, I don't know how many times over the past 6 years. And I don't know what's the importance of naming it as an intifada. And also I would mirror what Razan has said. I feel like there's been a build-up. This is, you know, like what you said in the beginning when you were introducing Razan, you know, revolution is not a one-time event. It's a process that's been happening. And I feel like this is a continuation to kind of what's happening. If there's a difference that came up to mind, and also Razan pointed to, is let's say the difference between the first intifada, second intifada, and what's happening now is that now people are more immersed in this illusion of a state that we don't really have, but people, you know, there's organizations, there are government institutions, we have like steady jobs, some of us have health insurance, some of us are thinking of their plans to go, I don't know, travel somewhere over the summer. So there's like these things that you know, they started becoming more and more materialistic things. They started becoming more and more important over the past few years that people now are afraid to kind of lose because some are looking for this stability. And most people who are now on the streets are very much aware that this is just an illusion. It's not really, we're not really living in a stable situation. It's very much far away from that. So I think maybe in terms of the differences, this could be the first thing that jumped to my mind. But in terms of what to name it, I think it's just a continuation of the revolution we've been carrying since forever. Yeah, I'll leave it now to Rana.
Yeah, I really agree with what Waid said. But my first thought when you asked the question was that if we were having this conversation in like mid-May, we might have really quickly said yes.
Yeah.
Because there were certain moments where we were seeing things that I haven't seen in my life, that a lot of us haven't seen since we were really young, that were feeling so unprecedented and so like magnificent that we were really quick at those moments to say this is an intifada. But I think that seeing how the cycle goes up and down really like, and Razan naming all of the things that we've seen happen, especially here in the West Bank over the last, I think you went back 10 years or 12 years, like we know that it's a cycle and that we are getting closer. I mean, the protests that we're seeing the last few days are saying things we couldn't have said in the streets 10 years ago, that everyone was too afraid to say 10 years ago, even though we all, you know, were already there in our minds. I think one of the things that is really different, and why I also kind of was alluding to this, is just the ways that the Palestinian Authority has become such a large institution, and it has entrenched such like destructive neoliberal policies that really pose a huge obstacle to any kind of revolution. I mean, this isn't a Palestine specific issue. We see this around the world, the ways that capitalism keeps people from revolting, even when their status quo is not good. But you know, PA policies have further entrenched the fragmentation, the reliance on donors and on the international world. We're seeing internal political repression. And a lot of people here, I mean, we hear this all the time, like people feel like it will be impossible or very difficult to challenge Israel without first challenging the Palestinian Authority and dismantling some of the internal like policing that we're seeing before we can even begin to bring down the larger colonial structures on us.
This is interesting. I mean, the terms you're using. I want you guys to talk, but I have to share with you resonances I'm hearing. Right? Donna, you said this is different than what you would have imagined 10 years ago, right? 10 years ago, you know, in 2011, I'm in Tunisia. And much of what you're talking about now is being set on the ground in Tunisia. as I listen to your responses, the resonance that I see, we had a preliminary conversation back in May, and I said this then, are really less with the intifadas that took place in the West Bank at the beginning of this century in the 1980s than with what began to happen in, Abu Zayd, in Tunisia, and then, spread into Tahrir. But I want to see a resonance with Tunisia for a very specific reason, in that one, it was spontaneous, but not. And in the sense that it wasn't, was, as you're saying, Rana, there was a long practice of activism around the syndicalist movement that included the arts, right? which fostered over decades a particular kind of mind, right? A particular kind of subject who was capable of taking to the streets without leadership, and that's what we mean when we say spontaneous, without being led by a vanguardist party, without being led by the leadership of the unions, in fact, right? But in ways in which the population, beginning in Pesrain and Ghafsa, Zayt, were able to organize themselves using many of the tools of the current media, but also other organizing tools to engage in public disturbance that had a political consequence, right? I mean, we can have a long discussion of when al-intifada or al-mudaharat becomes thawra, when it becomes something called revolution, right? And the point you make, Razan, both in your motto and in your remarks, that, wow, I echoed about the revolution not being a one-moment thing. In 2016, when I was participating in an organizing event that involved the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and a whole group of people that I've been working with in Tunisia that involved women's cooperatives, it's really quite diverse, and including intellectuals, right? The position being taken from the floor, from the street, was, we're involved in a project of reimagining civil society. That's a project that will take decades, just like the French Revolution took decades. So this may be a moment in which the technocrats are in power. This may be a moment of ups and downs. I'm still speaking of Tunisia, in which unemployment is rampant, in which the pandemic, COVID, is causing all kinds of despair, and in which the economic circumstances are causing all kinds of despair, and there are all kinds of other problems. But the process of transformation is changing and is continuing, right? And the aspirations are continuing. So that resonance I'm hearing in what you just said in response to my initial question, which is why I like the response of no name, but also the sense that it's spontaneous and organized in that kind of almost paradoxical way, which is to say that the bases of organization don't follow traditional political patterns. They're not coming from the political party. And indeed, I'd like you to speak a bit more about the neoliberal aspects, because I wanted later on to talk about Nizar Banat's killing and what that means in terms of the ways in which the Palestinian Authority has emerged as a particular kind of neoliberal state, right? And how that mirrors other phenomena. And I ask the four of you, because you've been involved in critiquing this phenomena elsewhere, right? Including recently what's going on in Chile, but in your respective works in Canada and elsewhere. The way in which the Palestinian state looks like a neoliberal state, and in so doing, the ways in which the authorities become kind of an instrument of the logic of the secular, if that question makes any sense, right? And what interests me then is, if there is the resonance I'm talking about, then there's some kind of subject that's emerging on the ground among the Palestinians that perhaps is distinctive. To make my question a bit more coherent, because I want you to talk about that. In the case of Tunisia, and I've written about this at some length, that subject was very much a part of the long Bourguiba project of a certain kind of secularization. Right? And it produced a very particular kind of subject, a restless subject, as Al-Mis'adi, who was the architect of the education reform, labeled it, right? Which of course is a fundamentally ungovernable subject. Right, a subject that one of the youth of revolutions told me in 2011 was constitutively anarchic, right? Bila sultawiyya, and there's a beginning of trying to understand the historical conditions by which that subject was created, and that's just the first step, because then when you understand that, there's the problem of understanding the nature of politics, because it means a different kind of politics, right? A different understanding of the dynamics that are going on, which I don't think we necessarily understand. So the question I'm asking in this regard, and there are two questions. Firstly, is there a new or emerging Palestinian? Right. In the past 10 years or so that you're describing in your growing up, are we seeing a way of thinking and a set of life practices that weren't there before, or weren't there before in the same kind of discrete way they appear to be here now? And then the follow-up to that is, with regards to such a subject, what are its goals? What are your goals and aspirations? And I mean to include in this question your worldview in the broadest sense, and notions of fundamental human being, if any. And that question is spurred by your references, your collective references to neoliberalism. And you're characterizing this kind of movement that's happening, whether it's spontaneous or organized, as a reaction against a kind of global organizing of life under, as you say, why, the illusion of the state. Right, which one could say that that's become a global illusion when we look at the emergence of non-state players. We can give long examples around the world that speak to this. And one of the issues that I find is interesting about them is the ways in which those non-state players, in maintaining order, function like gangs. The activity of the Palestinian Authority is very much akin to the activity of the Jamaican Dons in the last decade of the 20th century and the first decade of this century. So those are the next set of provocations. I hope that wasn't too much. A little bit too much. Well, you've provoked me with your responses to my initial provocation. So let's begin with the first one. Is there a new or emerging Palestinian? Another way of saying is, what are you? How would you characterize yourself? Right. Speaking a bit more to those 10 years of formation that Rana. I mean, Ahmed, to help this go along. So, you know, what kind of creature is it? Pardon my language, but what kind of creature is it that can organize legal activity against the efforts of Palestinians to create real state developments as a part of the advancement?
So here's the thing. For the past, I want to say not 10 years. You've said for the past 10 years. I want to go back a little more. For the past 14 years, I would say there's definitely been a creating and then an uncreating and then a recreating of a Palestinian. In 2007, with the Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, we've definitely began a neoliberal Palestine, or at least a neoliberal Palestine. You know, I don't want to say a state, and I'll go back to that later, but for the sake of the argument, a new state that looks like, you know, every other modern state, a state that functions on banks, loans, mortgages. You buy your car on the bank, you buy your new house using the bank, et cetera, et cetera. You have your job, you have your government job, or you have your, you know, foreign company job that pays you relatively well, especially if you work in Ramallah and all that. That created what Wa'ad said, the illusion of a state, that illusion of something that you have to, worry about, that you fear of losing in case you ask for any kind of action. After that, we've had the uncreating of that, especially with the realization of that, like everything that involves this system is still a hostage for A, the Israeli discretion, and B, also for the oligarchy and the Palestinian government. And then that led us to the last point, the recreating of a Palestinian, which is right now, basically, which is a Palestinian that realized that this system has failed them. And the system is that led us to having all these escalations, for the lack of a better term right now in my head, with the Israeli occupation and with the Palestinian Authority. Right now, going back to the use of the word state, right now there's a general realization that we don't really live in a state. We don't really live in a neoliberal state. We live in a neoliberal security force system. We live in one big central intelligence system governed by a small number of people that doesn't necessarily serve the Palestinian people, the old or new Palestinian people. We live in a security force system where if you speak up against the Palestinian Authority, you're immediately arrested, if not by the Palestinian Authority, by the Israeli security forces. This is like the security coordination that works between both sides, like, one arrests and one delivers and vice versa. So especially recently, and not recently, it's been going on forever, but because people have gained momentum and I hope to say courage too, to speak this on the ground more and more. And we've heard it with mottos like, I want to try to translate it in English, is ليش تنسيق الأمني ليش مرة سلطة ومرة الجيش, like why security coordination once the PA and once the Israelis. We see this mirroring of the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli forces against Palestinians. So the new Palestinian, that you talked about, realizes that the Palestinian security force in shape of a state is merely one more security force that is governed by the Israelis, and that's it. And that has nothing to do with serving any Palestinian interest whatsoever, except the few Palestinians who are in charge of that security force.
I want to make a slight correction in the translation because it really underscores what you're saying. Marra sulta, on the one hand, the authority. Marra al-jaysh, not the Israeli. Marra al-jaysh, you say. On the other hand, the army,
which is referred to the Israeli army.
Yeah, but that relationship underscores what you're saying about a security regime, in the extent to which there is no nation state per se.
Yeah,
but there's a security state.
There's a security force. It's not even a state. A state has bodies governing, efficient bodies, efficient governing bodies. You're talking about a state that has actual representation and a state that has sovereignty. The Palestinian state has the West Bank and Gaza are 22% of historic Palestine, and the Palestinian state has control over less than 6%. Area A's and B's. I don't have exact percentages, but it's close to that. You're talking about a state that can only control 6% of its land. I mean, that's that's not a state, by like international law standards. One of the founding aspects of a state is sovereignty. A state that has no sovereignty is not a state. A state that asks for no sovereignty is not a state. A state that needs to have security coordination for it to go enforce judicial verdicts in Area Cs is not a state that can't enforce its own judicial verdicts in its own land is not a real state. Unless, of course, it has to do with going to Area Cs and assassinating human rights activists, like Nizar Banat, then it becomes a real state. Otherwise, it's not.
Razan, this subject that Ahmed's talking about, what is formed it? Has it been these sort of nebulous forces that have been going on for 14 years he's talking about? Or?
I mean, let's be real. Also, I don't want you to complicate the question, Ruthie. No, but yeah, by all means, complicated. I was on a different wavelength this way, so let me gather myself. I feel, it's not separated, and this is something that is important, that I could state that it's not separated and yet maintain its uniqueness and difference and complexity. That Palestine was decided as the neoliberal project in the 1989 Washington Consensus based in the US. So when we're talking about this neoliberal process, this neoliberal project, it's something that is unfortunately, but entrenched everywhere. When you first asked the question about this new Palestinian in the making, the things I was jotting down is, debilitation is the constant state. Necropolitics was the precursor, but disposabilities turned to maiming. So there are versions and multitudes in the making. I think that's maybe one of the reasons we all kind of stood still as you asked, because there is a weight in the question to have an answer when I don't even know who I am in the making to come. One thing I could speak to is that we are a population, and I mean from the river to the sea, from the north to the south, we are a population of youth. And when I say youth, I also don't mean my 28 able-bodied self. I mean children in Gaza, I mean young, right? And I don't want to romanticize because I get, it's very even erotically stimulating for me to say, yes, anarchy, because I don't want to romanticize and say it is full anarchy. One thing I do look at with hope is the absurdity. That's what we're turning to, because we've constantly been told, especially in front of a gaze of a Western international law audience, to humanize ourselves. And there's been a part of our continued disavowal that felt quenched in that gaze. And I don't want to go in the line of romanticizing further. And I will say that there was hope somewhere, and we see that it's not there. We're asked to rationalize something that's completely irrational. So what's left is fucking absurdity. So that's something I do want to hint to. It's that I see pain too. And I see that what's also in the making is that bribery in a lot of ways in our country has become wisdom. Although there are many of us going down on the streets, my partner's family lives in a camp surrounding Ramallah. And when I go to visit, and when we're talking about what's happening, it's a very different perspective. When I have extended cousins that I just find out 4 days after my own sister's arm was completely bashed, that he went down. And when I find out it's because and then I have to look at my privileged ass with a US citizenship and really bring it into, and I don't want to delve into the grossness of identity politics. That's not where I'm saying to go. But there is also conversations to be had about the levels of sacrifice Palestinians have felt they've engaged in, and how much they felt that sacrifice has become alienated from identity. And I feel it ties into your question about who are those creating these pseudo states. And it is, we're in the age of identity entrepreneurs. And for so long for us, we felt like I grew up, I feel, it's necessary. We hold on to our hawiyya, not the fucking piece of paper. Sorry, I'm like F-bomb.
Identity, hawiyya.
No, not the piece of paper, but this storyline, this heritage, this lineage of this is who we are. And increasingly, we talk about systems of collective punishment, but increasingly what it's done is our identities are literally commodified and sold, that we are in this suspension of who are we? And so to answer your question, we are in the making, and we will continue to be in the making. And, there's going to be a spectrum. And there's some ends of that spectrum I really, really don't like. But, you know, if I want it to be multitudes and accept the multitudes, it's going to come in how it's going to come. And I feel our tasks with all our different capabilities and skills and passions and creative reimaginations is to be willing to hold that space. Because as you said, there's nothing as shocking as seeing your own sibling in riot gear. After you see what's happening in Beta, you see what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah, what's been happening, that's a pain that, yeah, like activates my parasympathetic nervous system right now. That's something like very visceral. And we're moving through it. We're moving through it.
It's an energizing thing.
Shukran, yeah.
But I don't know, Rana, what I'm hearing here, tell me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing really in the outlines of what's being said is that Oslo was of no moment. That
was that Oslo is of no moment.
Of no moment. That this structure of absurdity, right? And I want to explore more the extent to which this notion of absurdity is widespread, because there's a lot of interesting resonances there. Is the absurdity of that promise, right? Mm. And there's almost like a fundamental social question, but also existential question here. You know, if indeed I'm hearing right that at least you all are saying, you know, Oslo was of no moment. Right? The 1989 Washington Accord, right? The idea of the two-state solution is a sham, right? Yeah. Edward Said said then it was an absurdity, right? Yeah. I remember him writing in El Ahram, the edition paper in the English edition, that how could the PLO expect the Americans to broker anything honestly? You only had to look at how they treat their own population. And you've got, you know, 200 years of genocide and 200 years of enslavement. So what makes you think they're going to treat you any differently, right? And this goes back to something we can get to. I've got a question about it, and that's the extent to which among Palestinians here and in the occupied territories, an increasing attention to the question of settler colonialism and to the kind of long continuum of a particular attitude, which I would call the attitude of modernity, and how that plays out. So it sounds like you guys are I don't want to use something silly like the phrase post-Oslo, but you're saying that the sense of absurdity, the sense of despair, the multitude, the dynamic nebulous formulation is very much a remarkable, as in noticeable, profound manifestation of the absurdity of that idea of a Palestinian state. And let's dwell on this for a moment, right? Because for my generation, the notion of a Palestinian state is not just a question of al-Hawiyya al-Palestiniya. There's also a question of al-Qawmiyya al-Arabiyya, right? The very notion of Arabness. So to abandon it is to abandon a lot. And I would say on that note as well, that 1990 showed the absurdity of that project too. And I'm talking about the first Gulf War, and the Iraqi invasion made it very clear that you know, ما في شيء يسمى القضية العربية هذه حلم يعني خيال. So are you indeed not Oslo? Are you indeed all of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of us never were with Oslo. Like for me, because my father's a refugee who has not been allowed back in since 1948. You know, for most of the Palestinians who were already displaced when Oslo happened, it felt like a huge betrayal. And that is kind of like how the word was set outside of Palestine. And then I do think, I mean, I didn't grow up fully here, so I don't know how the progression to where we are now, with thousands of people chanting, you know, that Oslo has long fallen in the streets. I mean, people were chanting that Oslo fell in 2011, 12, you know, here in Ramallah. So it's not completely new. Now they're chanting that the entire authority needs to fall. That's the progression. But yeah, I think I just also like, I really felt what Razan said about the weight of a question of answering, you know, what is, it's so impossible to define what the Palestinian is now. It's impossible. It's such an impossible feat, especially, you know, this week when, like everyone has already said, you know, we're protesting in front of Palestinians in riot police gear who are trained by international security forces. And, you know, so what is the Palestinian today? It's an impossible question for me. It's such a weight, such a heavy question. But for me personally,
Razan says your cousin or your brother who's in the riot here.
Yeah, my cousins. I have a lot of relatives who are part of the Palestinian Authority. A lot of the time for a living. I mean, that's what people usually say when we ask. Very few people I know who are ideologically, you know, strong, but there are.
So what's your aspiration? Individually, collectively, right? If it's no longer the aspiration of generations, right, which is an independent state, and if indeed we have a situation of profound absurdity, Razan, but it's not an absurdity that can go on forever, right? What do you want? What are you hoping for? What's the world that you imagine in relation to the world that you live in?
You know, I'm gonna take a little detour to this question. When I moved to Memphis, Tennessee, I was like 19 years old. I have a good US American accent because my mom was born and raised in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, and moved back when she was 17. So I don't say pak the ka, but you know, I have this accent. And so my first time really living in the United States, I got this car, I was really excited. I got this used car. I was like, wow, Siyara for $2,000. Woo! Like, you know, I could never do that in Palestine unless it's mashtube. And it's hard to get a good mashtube. And so, you know, I drove with we were labor organizers, and I drove from state to state to go to another campus. And something happened at the 2-hour mark where I just started to cry. I cried, and psychoanalysts like to say that crying is a form of resistance. And trust me, sibling, it was a form of release and surrender. It wasn't resistance at that point. And it harkened on me that I'd never felt what it's like to be on an open road with that not being the obstacle, a checkpoint, a wall, a reminder, something made, iconized, but made so averse, made so entrenched in my, like conscious, like it was just bizarre. So when you ask this question of where we want to go, there's a lot that's been systematized in how even if I want to come share with you my dream and my aspiration, I know there are those still, unfortunately, boundaries and limits on it. What I do know is that it's profound. It's as deep and explorative as the ocean floor that we haven't touched. And I really just, I want more moments of breaking that, of breaking the hold that something is normal, realizing it's not. And for me as Razan, it might look like, I mean, this is me being really out there, but it might literally be something for me as simple as not having to wear a bra to work. I have small chest, but mighty nipples. And for me, this feels like something that's has to do with my body, but how I navigate space, and then how I live the gender policing over the security, settler state policing, over like, you know, patriarchal gaze, all of these things. So if it was that, it's a kind of me saying a bare body statement. And I would want to know what it feels like to do that and not wince and have that hypervigilance protect me. I would want to be able to sit with family and not call it that I'm going to see the refugee camp, that I could actually go and visit where my partner's family was displaced from. And not in the sense of like, oh, this is the displaced village, but in the sense of, I wonder if their olives taste better than our olives. You know, something like this for me is beyond. I mean, I haven't really tried it in this way. And I'm trying to give very mundane examples because I feel that it was a mundane break that I experienced in driving from Tennessee to Mississippi that you know, happened. And I don't know what the mundane might bring. I want to re-explore that mundane because there's a lot of magic there that's been set aside.
Yeah, I'm mindful of what you're speaking as a clinician.
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm talking right now is like, I don't know. Yeah.
And so I'm also, you know, I'm trying to get through all the questions I have, but I'm also really interested in the extent to which this breaking of the mundane, right, isn't an aspiration, an attitude you don't encounter often among those that you're offering therapy. And again, I'm saying this very mindful of the Fanonian legacy, the point of that project, that was recognizing the sociogenesis of psychosis, right? And those mundane issues matter, and those things that energize. And also, I'm smiling as you're talking about that feeling of release that you had driving across the border from Tennessee into Mississippi. Yeah. And when I've made that same drive, for obvious reasons, feeling is precisely the feeling that you have of having to deal with al-Hajj in Palestine, right? That's, in fact, in this day and age, when I cross almost any state border, I'm always, you know, waiting for that, which inevitably does happen, you know, not always with the same degree of imminent existential danger, but always with a certain kind of tension, mundane matters. But I'm also wanting to ask, and you guys are really forcing me to collapse these questions, which is great, in terms of your remark about the might of your, well, I love that phrase, right? My breasts are small, but my nipples are mighty, right? You know, and you know, that bears on the notion that there can be no revolution if women aren't free. Right? Yes. So I asked, you know, what does Mansour Abbas's Ram's party being in coalition with Bennett's Yamin, right? And Labid's Yesh Atif party mean for you? Right? And mean for these kind of Palestinians? Oh, I've struck a nerve looking at Ahmed Ismail in general, right? Because as you know, there's this whole discourse going back to Sheikh Abdullah Nimr Darwish, right? And who's no longer with us, but Rabbi Melchor still is, right? And Darwish's successor, Badr, seems to continue it. This idea that the religious right is the solution. So I mean, what does it mean that in terms of this being caught between Sulta wa Jaysh, the authority, and the Israelis? There's a triangulation there, right? And the religious right, where an iteration of Hamas can sit down with the ultra orthodox to imagine, and this is real, to imagine the structure of the society that you and everybody else is going to live in. I can't help but to think that Razan, your remark about that mundane resistance isn't bearing these events in mind. Or is that a predictable question? What does this coalition mean?
Like between Mansour Abbas and Ultra, right?
And yeah. And
Mansour Abbas was never, here's the thing. Mansour Abbas did not at least eventually make a coalition with the ultra-right. Mansour Abbas made a coalition with the centrists and the liberal parties of Israel. He did have a former coalition with the ultra-right. So he's clearly friends with everybody. But this is a really wide question. You're talking about the Institute of the Knesset, the Institute of colonial state. So first of all, you're talking about Mansour Abbas being a part of a colonial body, which is the Knesset, and having no problem making any coalitions with anybody. The right, the center, the left, whoever, as long as he makes it into the Knesset. Maybe they give him even like a small ministry, who knows what his deal was with them. Mansour Abbas was actually part of the Mushtaraka, the bigger Arab coalition party in Israel, until, at least publicly, his biggest problem with them was the law in support of the LGBT community in Israel. I mean, as a progressive movement led by youth people, be it in the 48, West Bank, Gaza, or Jerusalem, this is clearly something that we denounce. Mansour Abbas' stance against the LGBT community is something we denounce. I don't know about everybody else, but the Arab participation in the Israeli Knesset itself is merely a joke. It's a facade of Israeli democracy anyway. Be it in Mansour Abbas's coalition in the government or the opposition that is jokingly right now led by leftist parties, Israeli and Palestinians from the 48, who are now having a coalition with Netanyahu. Like the leftist Israeli parties are now in coalition with the ultra-right as an opposition of the current government, which also has Arab members of it. The whole Arab participation in the Knesset is just something that has no real results on the ground. You still have illegal, quote unquote, illegal housing in the Naqab. You still have Jisr al-Zarqa, which is one of the poorest cities in the 48. It's an Arab city. This is the city that borders Netanyahu's city, which is extremely funded. Jisr al-Zarqa has no underground water supply. And, of course, you would know what Netanyahu's town has. This has been going on since the existence of the state of Israel. Arab citizens of Israel are fourth-class citizens. The Israeli Arab, for to use that term, Israeli Arab participation in the Knesset has done nothing to improve this whatsoever. Mansour Abbas, if I want to be polite in describing him, he is a pawn. Since this might be recorded, I'd like to stay polite on describing Mansour Abbas. He's a pawn, like everybody else in the Knesset of the Arab members. Yeah, so they do nothing. I think they also have an identity issue, especially Mansour Abbas and his party. They have an identity issue where they forgot that they're Palestinians in the 48. And now they describe their fellow Palestinians as terrorists and that they would never deal with terrorists. This is maybe a small comment on Mansour Abbas and the greater Arab participation in the Knesset.
Of course, part of that's really quite clarifying. Part of the thrust of my question, though, was there's it's not even creeping. It's a clear tendency towards a religiousization of the issue, right? And more than Abbas, right? It is Sheikh Badr's willingness to interact with Rabbi Melchar, right? in reimagining the social space, which is very close to Hamas's rule in Gaza, which polices women, which polices morality, in terms of a very stringent interpretation of Sunnah.
I'm sorry, yeah, that was the other part that I wanted to touch on. Sorry if I'm like taking longer, but I mean the whole religious discourse anyway. You know, of course, we've known this, we've talked about this amongst ourselves in our circles and everything, but it's also important to reiterate it. The Palestinian issue is not a religious issue. You are never going to solve the Palestinian issue by strictly talking about it from a religious point of view. Palestine is not Muslims versus Jews. It's very important to say. There's a lot of talk about this. Maybe we can explain this in a different panel. Palestine is not a religious issue. Us as youth activists, we have a strong. Of course, we have a problem with colonialism, but also we have a huge problem with right-wing parties, etc. We have a problem with religious extremists from right-wing Jewish parties. We also have a problem with Hamas's social parties as well, like Islamism. We might agree with the notion of anti-colonialism with some parties, but we certainly never agree with the Hamas police chasing women on the beach, forcing them to be dressed in a specific way, or chasing people driving in a car, making sure their relatives or whatnot. What clergymen try to do by trying to have that interfaith talk to try to solve the Palestinian cause, it's just something that makes them feel good about themselves as clergymen. It's important to have progressive speech amongst clergymen because they do affect a lot of their followers, but it's also extremely important to realize, to also further confirm that Palestine is not a problem of rabbis versus sheikhs. It's a problem of colonialism.
This is a very important topic, and you're going exactly where I kind of wanted to go in discussing it, because what I wanted to hear was what you guys have been saying among yourselves about this. That's why I asked it in light of Razan's remarks, right? Because there is then a struggle that people like you are engaged in on multiple fronts. And you've listed two of them clearly. You both on the front of conservatism, social conservatism, we'll call it that, or religiosity, right? As well as on the front of colonialism in general. And I think you point out nicely the ways in which those two things are really imbricated, right? and powerful. There's another struggle as well, because and here we're going to talk briefly about building solidarity, that for a long time, going back at least to 2000, but earlier, the left in the West has identified Islamist movements as fundamentally anti-imperialist and anti-colonial, right? And give it a certain kind of credibility and support in that way, generally at the expense of individuals like yourselves, progressives, on the ground. And that was the thrust of my question, whether or not, I'm interested in the kind of conversations you've had among yourselves about this, because clearly that means you recognize it's a real issue, it's a real threat, right? And it's a triangulation, right? You have Sulta, you have Jaysh, or you have Deen. And it doesn't matter if it's Deen al-Yahud, the Jewish religion, or Deen al-Muslimin, or al-Islamiyin, as we call it. How do you think about that? How do you navigate that? How do you contend with that? What does it mean for you? This was the thrust of the question. You've answered it by saying you've been talking about it. I don't know if we need to wait for another panel to hear that conversation. And then I'll say this and leave the floor back over to you guys. I was born in 1954. I'm of a very particular activist generation. I spent a good deal of my youth in Cairo in the 70s. And was in Beirut in 76 and 77. That fact says it. tells you something. And among some of the Fida'iyyin whom I knew at that time, the radical push was to Islamicize the struggle. Right? I mean, this was the move that was going to lead to Hamas. And that's become mainstream. And in some sense, what you're doing is almost full circle and pushing back against. That was a provocation, not to argue and shut you up, but to get you to pick up the thread a bit.
Yeah, if I could add to the conversation, I've been thinking like with what Ahmed has been saying, that this is not a religious conflict. And yes, we all I assume we all agree, but at the same time, religion is an important, I think we can't ignore it. It is an important element of our struggle. There's so many Palestinians do have this connection with the land, with the Palestinian cause based on being Muslim, based on the importance of not just being Muslim actually, but based also on the importance of our religious sides, especially with what's been happening. Like if you look back at what's happened in April and May, a huge catalyst for that was the assault on Al-Aqsa Mosque. And also like the connection to, Hamas being a military, like the military wing, which is also like an Islamist wing, doing the revolutionary work, doing the resistance work, so on and so forth. I think as much as we, like, I don't know how to articulate this, but I think it's important to not kind of exclude religion or put it in this, I don't know, kind of like demonizing way that it is this, I don't know how to articulate it, to be honest, but I think it's an important element of our struggle. Mm-hmm. I know my grandma's connection to the land is so much connected with her being raised as a Muslim girl in the old city. Hart al-Magharba, which was completely destroyed, and then moving to be actually to live right next to Al-Aqsa Mosque and Dome of the Rock. So I think it's important not to lose that. It's important to focus on that, and it's important to also keep it. I think if we lose that, we'll also lose families and friends and revolutionary members, let's call it that way. If I can. So yeah, I don't know. Just wanted to just add that real quick.
Yeah, and if I can build on what I also hear and feel from wide sharing is this, okay, I don't know if it was 1976 or 1979, but that there was a wave in Palestine where all of the municipalities had voted leftist, communist, ru'asa baladiyya, like heads of municipality, or I don't know what you call them. Mm-hmm. And then that's when like Abu Jihad, where lots of the focus of the PLO was outside, right? And what was going on in Lebanon and all of this became, oh shit, we need a head here, and did his connections with Qatar and all of these other countries. And why am I naming it as such? Because what we end up doing is we conflate the spirituality and the appreciation and the lineages in Palestine across, Abrahamic religions and whatnot, with Wahhabism. Mm-hmm. And this is like, what I feel you were also referring to when you talk about Muslim, and we do talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, mm-hmm. and how these kinds of ideological instruments compete and really coerce people by, and it's just the older form of identity entrepreneurship that we're seeing today with populist parties in Berishu and Trump and Vero. And so there is like two things that happens for me, maybe they're not two, I just said the number two. But there's something that happens that is like, sacred values are powerful. And, you mentioned Fanon, and let's not underestimate when Fanon calls upon and conjures the example of he writes about it as superstitious beliefs, but it's really this system of fantasy that can work to really reduce the weight of colonialism. What it does is, I have the jinn to fear, so who the F are you, colonizer, right? And I think that's the powerful thing, that when you're talking, why I was saying, let's not lose that. It's one of the bridges we still have open into that infinite fantasy, into that infinite reimagination that is so lush and abundant. And as Ahmed is commenting, as you commented, It's literally being suffocated and manipulated. And just as we see with other normative powers, what do normative powers do? They co-opt and try to assimilate the counter, the revolutionary. And I wouldn't really name Hamas as like a military branch as revolutionary, because I will say the militancy that is also, being responded to as a political move for themselves in this moment. This was invigorating. It's invigorating to see power in this way. Thus, I don't know, Yani, if I left a lot of your question, but yeah.
No, you none of you are leaving any of the questions unanswered. That and then some. Rana, let me ask something apropos of this, specifically of you. Dunam, right? That project comes to mind. And it comes to mind because of the ways in which the land, both as material, but also as symbolism, is a symbol of a tradition, right? A traditional way of being. And a traditional way of being that's wrapped up with symbols that you want to call religious. Okay? Religious. So how does your project, if at all, address that? And what I'm getting out of Ahmed's responses and Waed's responses and Razan's responses is precisely the conversation I want to hear. How are you navigating this thorny issue, right, of the religious at so many levels? But now I want to talk about it for a minute artistically.
Yeah. I haven't thought a lot about how it fits in. I mean, religion has always been a part of our lives in the way that some people in our family are very religious and many others are very secular. And to me, that's a very happy ideal, to just be whatever you want to be, and, without this kind of authoritarian force behind any specific religion. For me, the project that is being referred to is this project I was working on last year called 1/1000th of a Dunam, where I started bringing soil to my father, who's in Canada, in Turtle Island. And yeah, I started bringing him soil the first time I came here that I can remember, 2006. And I bring him soil every time that I go home to him, or go from home to home. And yeah, I've never thought of like these symbols as belonging to religion, although I think that people who are religious use them. Like, I just don't see how, symbols like land or the poppies or the cactus or the orange, these symbols that are the symbols of our nationhood in so many ways, they couldn't belong to a religion, because Palestinians are so many different religions and they belong to the nation. Yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No, you are. It's a nice way of beginning to wrap up. We have a few more moments because we're back to this question about, I didn't phrase it this way, but your language allows it. What is the nation, and is there a nation? Right? And again, I don't mean this in the abstract. I mean this precisely in terms of the young people who are leading this movement that we cannot name right now.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And the question of religion, I didn't mean to suggest that all this is subsumed by religion. I meant that it's a very interesting question, and one that you all are clearly in your activist circles concerned with, the fact that the events of the past 3 months have taken positively the energy of Hamas, right? And Hamas's militant response to the Israeli aggression. And that's suggesting a particular kind of synergy that I want to understand a bit more. And understand in its own terms, not my terms, but its terms. Did that make sense?
I just have
or am I doing what Razan accused me of before, which is complicating the question?
You're asking about a nation or like?
Yeah, I mean, if the orange and 1/1000th of a dunam and the olive branch or the olive tree.
If we were talking about a nation, I want to go back to your remark about Arabness. Mm-hmm. I would say that I disagree with you on the non-existence of Arabness, maybe. I do think that there is a possibility of having a greater Arab body. I don't want to say not a nation, maybe not a state, you know, in an ideal, you know, imaginary world, we would not have nations or countries, but for the sake of it, you've mentioned the Gulf War. You've mentioned, you know, there has been a lot of Arab aggression. A lot of it is also, a lot of it is results of historical colonial projects. You know, when we look at the Gulf War, you know, Iraq versus Kuwait, you clearly see an American funded war. When you look at a lot of different Arab wars, you look at a lot of colonial leftovers. Even when you look at Palestine, when you look at the history of the Palestinian struggle, you see a lot of attack on the Arab identity of Palestine. A lot of Jews who were brought here in the first waves of immigration are Yemeni, Iraqi, Syrian Jews who were attacked in their Arabness. The Israeli system clearly brainwashed them into, they sat them down and they told them that you are not Arab Jews, you are Jews, and that's it. They wanted to take them out of their greater Arab heritage or a greater Arab culture. Palestine historically has been part of greater Syria. You know, this was southern Syria. This wasn't just Palestine. Like the whole area geographically was one big chunk of land. You could not separate those parts. They had the same relatively, you know, similar cultures, the same dialect, same language, obviously, very similar history shared with each other, regardless of religion. Even before the existence of Israel, we were all, I want to say, occupied by the Ottoman Empire in this part of land. Jews, Christians, Muslims, atheists, Baha'is, whatever. There was no distinction between your religion and your ethnicity, your identity as an Arab. But then, after the creation of the State of Israel and during, there was that separation of Jew and Arab, although a lot of them are the same thing. So yes, the problem of Palestine is also a problem with the greater Arab identity, because there was that defragmentation of the Arab identity on purpose by colonial states.
If I can jump in, Ahmed, no, I would, Ya Allah, I'm going to get so many beheaded over this, but there's a part of me that likes that, so Ya Allah. Okay. Arabness is, can feel transfused these days. Like any other ideological machine and apparatus, that it was like a way to subjugate and kind of collect people under one language. Like, you know, I'm really saying let's go back to the Futuhat al-Islamiyya, Arabicizing everything. You know, because I'll tell you something, Ahmed. Ana, for the longest time, I'm just speaking about my opinion. This is not like a Palestinian view or heck, it's one Palestinian view. And no, I would definitely, like, I would look up. I mean, my mother's name is Al-Fahira, my khalti's name is Damashq, my khal's name is Abdul Nasser, because my grandfather was very zealous about this like Arab unity, okay? And he was like, oh, Ittihad Arabi and all of that. When I moved to the United States, I got to meet for the very first time Assyrians. I got to meet Armenians. I got to meet people that very much call Southwest and North Africa, Southwest Asia and North Africa their home. And for me to kind of continue to put down this like Arab, I realized is it very different than other systems of like normativity in this way? When you ask R.A. Judy, I want to go back to the question about nation. For me, this is a very aggravating question, because the signifier of nation for me does not stand for anything, does not stand for something when you talk about what are the possibilities and the future and all of that. Part of me, at sometimes I'd be like, Ya Allah, I wish I could just Palestinian passport travel. I wish that I could check off if I'm doing an online survey that I'm from Palestine, right? Instead of like having to navigate all of these others. But then I ask myself, where is there currently a nation in the world that I really respect, that I really look up to and say, wow, this represents a kind of liberation, uninhibited, that continues to birth life and celebrate death in a way that understands it's going to bring forth other life. I don't see it. What I do want is a kind of openness. I want to move in spirit and embodiment to places that are right on the border of what is now a border. I want that. I don't want to say that Palestine is to just be for people that identify as Arab, right? Armenians call Jerusalem. This is something that we also forget. Jerusalem has huge, religious significance, but Jerusalem is also very significant for being a multicultural kind of merchandise hub. You had Bedouins, you had people from different ethnicities intermingling in this place. And in a lot of ways, I don't know if this is like me romanticizing and practicing nostalgia, but this is what I would hope for. I don't want to say that Palestine is only for Arab, because I have friends that maybe their mothers are Ukrainian and their father's Palestinian, and they have existed here. I look outside and I go to different parts of Palestine, and we all look very different. So then it becomes a question of what is Arab? What is Arab? And I think that your position, Ahmed, is actually saying that I want to reclaim this because it feels like the thing that's always being subverted and neglected and abused. And from that position, I feel you, brother. And I'm with you there, Ahmed. But long term, if we really are trying to reimagine things, do we want to recreate another system that excludes that? Because that's what sometimes it feels for me when you say I'll chant in Arabi in the Palestine Arabiya, okay? Because it in that point, it's a complete, in the tafsa, in the face of the settler colonial state and Zionism. However, when I'm talking and sitting with friends and comrades, siblings, ancestors visiting us in different ways, is that what I want to say? And for me, a liberated tomorrow is that this all just be Arab? I don't know.
The situation.
I know. Yeah, sorry.
No, I didn't mean to cut you off. Continue.
No, it's a great cutoff.
There's the situation is. So I was having a conversation last November with Hamid Riashi, who's one of the prominent figures in the Harik movement in Algeria, and also was one of the important novelists of the 1990s in Algeria. And it was on a blog that an Algerian, Nisa Daoudi, does, that takes up these contemporary issues in let's call the Arab world, right? And deliberately puts Arab intellectuals in contact with intellectuals from around the world to discuss these matters. Now, Ashi is an Algerian. He looks like my brother. In fact, Anissa likes to tease that we could be twins because we both have balded the same way, responded to the same way. And of course, in the Algerian context, to put a particular historical spin on this, Arabization, ta'arib, is a modern project. And it's a modern project that was promulgated by Abdel Nasser. And it's a project that was promulgated upon a very complex demographic situation, right? So La'ashi, in the context of the Harik movement, trying to imagine the civil society to be created, asked a provocative question, not in the way of condemning Arabism, but to say, you know, إيش هذا العرب؟ ما معنى العرب? This is a legitimate question. Right? What is this Arab? What does it mean? And it depends on where you're at. Right? So I grew up with the story in my maternal family that my maternal great-grandfather was from Sahara al-Gharbiyya, Western Sahara. And so, which is one of the reasons I went to Al-Azhar to do high school and university. And so when I went to Al-Azhar, I had a surrogate Egyptian family in a little village called, in Egyptian dialect, Owaisna, I would say Goisna, in Monafia. And I was really keen on interacting with Arabs, right? And my surrogate father, Abu Rishdi, said to me once, we were on the roof and I kept asking about Arabs. And he said, what's wrong with you? I'll show you Arabs. So he took me down to the camel market. See all those barefooted, scraggly, smelling people? Those are Arabs. إحنا مصريين. Right? 1975. And that was an interesting, this is Nasser's home country introduction for me as I became more fluent in the language and the culture of that particular place, Cairo, that the majority of the population saw themselves as being Egyptian, which of course is the historical conceptualization prior to the European presence, right? This person is from Jabal Lubnan, هذا رجل من دمشق, right? هذا رجل من you know, Darfur, من Sinar, right? The local identity. And even though people may have been speaking some version of the same language, there wasn't that unifying notion. I mean, we know the history of this. This notion of the Arab we're dealing with was one that was formulated by Bustani and Yazigi in response to the Ottoman formulation of an Ottoman national identity, which was part of the Ottomans' reaction to the European Enlightenment structure of the nation and an effort to combat it by creating an Ottoman equivalent. Right? So Bustani and Yazidi were worried that what would happen to those who didn't fit that what they were creating, the Ottoman were creating, the Young Turks, the Turkish identity. Right? So it's very much historically, as John's pointing out, it's part of a modern discourse. And Nasser takes that discourse and he says it in 56. Here's a cause that needs a leader, right? And then began to promulgate. So I think it's important to remember that history, but why do I tell that story now? Because when I look at what's happening in places like Tunisia, where, you know, in the wake of the revolution, it's brought to the fore that 16%, 16% من أعداد سكان تونس سمر سود. 16% are black, right? And the majority of them are not descendants of imported slaves, but they're the populations that were there going back to Herodotus and Diodorus who talk about them, right? And it comes out in the revolution, this matters, as a part of the movement to create a different kind of social structure. And in that aspect, the relationship to the Arabic tradition, to Arabic language, is not being put aside, but there's a recalibration that's taking place, right? That in my own personal exploration of it, makes us reimagine what we mean by words like ummah. Right? And this becomes, I think, a general global project. What are the constitutive elements of community? What principle are they based on? Are they based upon, as in the liberal case, the property of the individual, right? Who comes first for everything else? Or are they based upon a different kind of dynamic of collectivity? And I see, just to speak for myself, in movements like what's happening right now in Palestine and what's happening in Algeria and what's happening in Tunisia and also what's happening in Libya, where these same issues are coming up, right? A reimagining of what it is to belong to the Ummah, al-Ummah al-Arabiya, right? Which becomes, I don't want to say a new phase, but something else than what it was under the motto of al-Qawmiyya al-Arabi, right? that those movements are moving towards a particular kind of potential solidarity on the global scale that may indeed offer some examples for the rest of the world of how to imagine sociality beyond the nation state. So I mean, that was my remark when I said, what is this? This question, I was really echoing Ashi's remarks and the remarks of people, on the ground in those parts of the world. And I also know in Egypt, this is a question right now. And I'm talking about areas where there are large populations of Black, and so the new global interest in Blackness finds an articulation in those kind of countries in a particular way, because you've got a question of scale, right, of scale. But it's not a rejection of Arabness. It's saying, how do we reimagine Arabness? And it's not even saying it in terms of identity politics, but it's saying it in terms of social activity. So in the case of Egypt and Tunisia, those so-called Black Arabs are saying, no, we want to be part of the new social dynamic, right? We want to be elements of it. We want it to be opened up in this sort of way. Am I making sense? Right? And that's what I was trying to get at when forgive me for being so opportunistic, Rana, when Rana talked about the symbolisms of nation and relating that back to the question I asked about what is the new Palestinian. Because, I see, and you correct me if I'm wrong, when I'm watching that atrocious TV show that ran until last year with Donald Sutherland, what was it called? It was a spinoff of Zero Dark 30, where it was an anti-terrorist. I know this is being recorded and I'm embarrassing myself. I can't remember the name of it. It was very popular. And it had an embarrassing moment. It was filmed in London when the director wanted to have some authentic Arabic graffiti for a particular episode, right? And so they got a bunch of Palestinian graffiti artists to do the graffiti. And you're watching the episode. This was a very famous moment where the graffiti has written in Arabic, Black Lives Matter, right? It's a transcription of English, but it's in Arabic, Black Lives Matter. Right? And you have the same kind of thing happens in Ibil, in Sham, in Syria, right? I'm interested in the ways in which, in that reimagining of a particular kind of sociality, those issues are being part of the constitutive elements, just like in the case of all of you, where you're talking about the mottos about women must be free, right? That there's a fundamental reimagining of what it is to be human. And when I say reimagine, different from the nation state verbal construction and its derivatives, which I would include Qawbiya al-Arabiya, right? Different from 19th century romantic conceptions. Right? Definitely in opposition to neoliberalism. It's somehow inchoate, it's in early stages, but I'm detecting some different notion being performed of what it is to be human, whether you can name it or not, which is kind of what I've been asking you to do, to think about it. But in the performance and everything you're talking about, there's implied there a different notion of the human. And what's exciting for me is it's implied in your activity, right? In your activism. Where, Rana says, well, it's great. Everybody can be faithful and not be faithful, and that's the ideal situation, of which I agree. As I've got always my sebha wrapped around my arm, in a kind of paradoxical gesture. Well, I went to Al-Azhar, so I have to have some residue of that moment in my life when I was Abu Lahya and, insisting in the 70s that the Palestinian cause had to fundamentally be a Muslim cause. Okay? That statement, though, on your part, Rana, is an articulation of this different notion of the human I'm talking about. And maybe it's wrong for me to ask you to reflect upon it, but it strikes me in everything I read about what you're doing, and it strikes me in everything you guys say, right? And with the exception of Razan, this is my second conversation with, in the case of Ahmed, my fourth conversation. Everything you say speaks of this different notion of the human. And I'm really interested in the ways in which you are thinking about that yourselves. Hence my question is not about your clinical work, your therapeutic work. You know, the extent to which this is in play and among the notion of the absurd, that people are. Am I making sense? Does it resonate at all with what you're talking about, or have I completely missed what you've been saying and missed about them and babbling on pointlessly? I'm being disingenuous when I say that. No, I'm not babbling.
I was about to say, yeah, you missed it. You missed it hardcore, R.A. Judy. Ya Allah, I don't know what's going on with you today, man. But no, يعني I realize also I've spoken a lot. I do want to say it's beautiful. Why does she's like that's normal? Rana probably too. Ahmed, I look forward to grabbing a jam together sometime. But what's beautiful also that's emerged is in you naming the sociality shiftings is so wonderful that I didn't anticipate, Anjad, that I would be learning from you. And in this engagement back and forth, how this also, the action itself in the intermingling is bringing to light the sociality that you're talking about, the reimagining without like reverting. Yeah, shukran. شكرا وخليها المسبحة.
شكرا لوجه، لا شكرا لوجه. وأنا أستفيد منكم يعني عن جد بدون مبالغة يعني عن التلميذ، أنتم الأساتذة. لا بكل صراحة إحنا تلميذ مع بعض ونستفيد بين بعض يعني. We're together in this learning. One of the things I want to do, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, is I want to begin to bring these people that I'm having these conversations with in Algeria and Tunisia, that I'm having these conversations with in Minneapolis, right? In communication with one another, in exploring this as the project of solidarity. And one of the issues that I'm involved with is a campaign for the end of the Moroccan occupation of the Western Sahara. Which is not just a sentimental issue, it's also a political issue, right? Because that's the last colony in Africa that's foreign occupied, right? And the things that they're trying to do in imagining their sociality, what would happen if people began to speak to one another? Right? And that's in part and parcel what Ideas and Future is trying to do, because then you bring in people who are doing this kind of work in Pakistan, or in Nicaragua, or in Chile, or in the Dominican Republic, you know, where the conversation is not mediated by the mainstream media, and it's not curated by academic specialists who are still working with the old categories, but it's just kind of a very anarchic conversation in which questions come up and we speak with one another, and a kind of language emerges. It's my conviction that that's where there's going to be a certain kind of solidarity that's possible. There's a model for this, and it goes back to the Black Power movement, and a particular moment in the Black Power movement, not the moment of its origins in the United States, but a moment of what happens in the Caribbean, starting with Walter Rodney and the great Walter Rodney riots of '68. And that model is Rodney's practice of what he called grounding. And it was a situation very much akin to what you're talking about going on in Palestine and Jamaica, where there was a kind of contestation between a continuation of the European conceptualization of the state, in which the colored Creole class would rule, versus the larger segment of the population at a completely different, let's say, cultural, ethical matrix, right? And so Rodney was about trying to celebrate that matrix, going out and talking to people. And instead of telling them what their blackness is, but actually going out and sitting on the ground with them, and trying to understand their desire. And that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you. What are the structures of desire at play amongst all of you? Right? And in asking the question, what are the structures of desire, facilitating their having a language to critically articulate those desires and those imaginations. And from that practice of grounding was how mass democratic movement was to be fomented. Not a vanguard party coming and telling the people this is what you should be, but in that kind of interaction that Rodney's face to this practice was grounding. So I want to ask, do you guys do grounding? Right? And slip in that question I wanted to ask that I didn't get a chance to. And that's about the structure or desires. I know, Ahmed, that's a heavy question. Your face is very expressive.
Yeah.
أنت تتكلم من الصامت.
Right, I should mime.
What?
Yeah, I'm gonna need time to speak.
What?
I mean, I'm still hung up and stuck on the previous questions. So I'm still trying to, wrap my head around everything you're talking about. I don't know. I'm still thinking about what Razan has said before and what Ahmed has been saying. So I don't know if I should circulate back to that and maybe draw something out of it with what you just asked. Detouring. But I was thinking like what Razan was saying about, I don't know what to call it, like Arabism or like, yeah. I feel like I'm not at this point where Razan is, where she could think like way ahead, which I think is kind of impressive. I'm not there yet. Like in my head, I do want like an Arab Palestine where I could walk around in Jerusalem, like hearing the different dialects of Arabic from all over Palestine, from the river to the sea, from the north to the south. Like I want that. I think we've never had it. It has always been like, there's always been something or someone or some kind of colonization in some form of one way or the other. And I feel like this lost kind of, speaking of imagining and reimagining, like I can't imagine this actually. Like in my head, I can see it and I want to see it and I want it to happen. After we get that, after I live that for at least, I don't know, a year, then we can like start thinking about making it like this international multicultural hub that we're talking about. I do want this selfish moment of us actually getting to be these Arab Palestinians without having all these restrictions that are, since the day we were born, are being forced upon us. And like even going back to the question of like how we even identify with ourselves, or how we introduce ourselves, or how we see ourselves. Like I cannot think, like if you ask me what is what, and I'm speaking now not as just someone representing the Palestinian youth, because I can't. But for me, like I could never see myself separate from Palestine, and I see this both as a blessing as an issue, because sometimes I feel as much as I'm, let's say, like committed to my cause, because like this is naturally to all of us. At the same time, it's limiting because I feel like I can't think outside it. I was just, I just jotted down, like even my tattoos, most of my tattoos are something related to Palestine. I'm like, what is that? Like, this is not, like, I want to say not normal, but what is normal? Then that's even a bigger question. So I don't know, I feel like, now think of your question like structures, structure of desires. I don't know, I feel like now this conversation we're having, because for the past few months or even longer, we've been dealing with everything that's been happening, and we discussed this before, and we haven't had the time to kind of reflect or even like dive into a deeper thinking of what's like to kind of analyze and like work on steps forward. So I feel like this conversation and these conversations we've been having are kind of, you're creating more questions than answers, which is of course important, but yeah, I feel right now what we're taking out of this are the questions more than the answers, and what we're going to take out of this conversation once we're done with this and we actually like sit down and start thinking about the conversation we've had. I feel like we could be able to answer them, but I feel like right now most of these questions are just a work in progress.
If I can, you just also said إيش هو حكى about Arabs. Like I feel مش نفس هذا, but when I hear you saying this stuff, it is like another level that helps like reify for me and يجسد لي ويأكد لي على like مش عارفة كيف نحكي إشي ملموس, بس like إنه أمة in which you reconfigure and reimagine العربي أو العربية أو العروبة is not based على الأجندات السابقة. It's not based on the past, but it's this emergent. You know, I feel كمان إنه locality تبعتك, like we're in Jerusalem, like that's not also an experience I engage in. That's not my everyday. I'm not hearing Arabic as the lugha.
Yeah.
And so, and then I think about, like, you know, your references about the 16% in Tunisia and your experiences in Egypt. And then I think about the Amazigh in these areas as well, and how, you know, all of that is, and about your question about like these structures of desire, in a lot of ways, unfortunately here, like my mind goes to the systems of like psychology. And I think about that, what is desire, right? Like a raghba is that thing, it's that place that's always like, you can never really attain it. And that keeps the thrill, that keeps the drive, that keeps the boom, boom, boom. And what we see across like algorithms and these like new models of illusory desire is it's a desire saturation, it's a surplus, it's at your hand. And something is still like the gaping hole is still very open. And so when you ask me about these structures of desire, I would say that they're every day in the making. And it's, I think that there's something very interesting for me in like understanding my desire and these structures to emerge within what is presently known as perversion. You know, what is normatively defined as perversion. That's not saying it's taking the connotations and the significations, right, in the Webster dictionary in that is true, or like, but there's like something there for me that's like, if it's going to be regulated in a register, these structures of desire, then for me as Razan, that's where I'm being thrusted towards.
Perversion. You're being thrusted to perversion.
Oh.
No, I want to understand you. You're being thrusted towards perversion. Okay. Rana?
Just what's striking me while everyone talks is how different this conversation is than the one we had a few weeks ago, and the ways that everything around us has shifted so much since we last spoke. I think like coming out of May, I think a lot of us were feeling really a lot of the power of the moment. And the last few weeks, I don't even know if it's been weeks. I have no sense of how much time has passed since Nizar was executed. And it began to feel like incredibly unsafe for us here in the streets. And, you know, last time we were talking, I was taking photos of everything that was happening, and I haven't been able to take my camera with me the last few times we've had protests because Palestinian Authority police have been breaking people's phones and cameras and stealing women's phones in particular as a form of gender violence, to specifically use their gender against them. The things, you know, as we're talking right now on this call, I know like we're getting dozens of messages. I can also hear some of other people's phones buzzing when they're talking. You know, just down the street from us, people are protesting, and it's so hard to even think. Like last time we spoke, I remember Wyatt was like, I can't remember what you said actually, but you said something like, I can't think about the future or the solution right now. Like I'm in this moment, and this moment is really intense, and that's how I feel right now. I can't think about what I want or what, you know, I feel like my entire body responding to this moment. Yeah. And I see Ahmed wrote something in the chat. Kind of, I think.
Yeah, no, I was about to, yes, Ahmed. I was about to wrap it up.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to say something that touches on what you just said, Rana, and what, in fact, what you, Raza, and Wyatt just said. And I'll it's a parable, but I'll tell you the point of it up front. And the point of it, and I'll repeat the story, but I'll give the punchline, is that being in this moment and the intensity of the moment, right, in which the local responses, the local inflections to a problem are of paramount importance, that's the moment that speaks most fully to all of our humanity. And the parallel of that goes to, for example, why you're wanting to be able to walk down the streets of a Jerusalem where you're hearing Arabic, right? And that would indeed be lovely. I would share in that, in the joy of that, right? And the question of the Arabness that's there performatively is kind of like what Albert Murray, a great Black American artist, understood as the nature of all creative expression, that it's poetic and it's fabulous in its way, right? And in that poetry, it's responding to all kinds of universal problems, but the local responses are what matters. That statistics and sociologists can make sort of general statements, but it's the local in its particularity that speaks to what is the possibility of humankind. Right? And so I think this is important, that the intensity of the moment that you're in right now, just like the moment you were in 3 months ago, Rana, is what matters, right? And I think the importance of conversations like this in the intense moment is to always remind us that intense moment we're in is a moment that is germane to the entirety of the species, that you're not alone. And quite frankly, one of the things that motivates me in this is watching young Tunisian friends of mine go through the same sort of thing, so that by 2012, the world kind of forgot about them. But the issues of gender violence, of police violence, of unemployment didn't go away, and they're still in the struggle. Right? So I think it's important precisely to engage those intense local moments, respecting their locality, and respecting the locality is telling us something about all of us. I don't know if that adequately at all addresses what you just said. I can only hope it does. And with that hope, I want to again thank the four of you. I very much appreciated your spending this much time and entertaining my questions.
Thank you.
We're sincere and honest, and I'm ever mindful of the circumstances you're in, and I do hope that nothing here is going to exacerbate the dangers for you. I will make sure that you get copies of this as well as its transcript. Sadia will take it and edit it and clean it up, and you'll have a chance to see it before it broadcasts, right? Because it will broadcast. And on a personal note, I do hope that the five of us can stay in communication, especially in light of these closing comments, right? So you are on my أنتم على بالي.
Thank you.
I've been كنت أخوف شوي عليكم يعني من حوالي شهرين. لأني أعرف الوضع حل في الأرض المحتلة وضع صعب جدا وخطير. So don't be strangers. لا تغيبوا من فضلك. لا تغيبوا لا تغيبوا. والله هذه كانت فرصة طيبة جدا وأشكركم ألف مئة مرة. يا ريت كنا نعمل هذا الحوار باللغة العربية. هذا يكون جيد. ممكن الفرصة الثانية في المستقبل، وإن شاء الله تكون فرصة في المستقبل. على العموم تبقوا على خير، كما احنا نقول السلامة. السلامة.
سلام. شكرا كثير عن جد.
شكرا. السلامة.
سلام.